Welcome to God Press. Revelation 13 verses 16 to 18 reads, "It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name." This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. The biblical passage describes a system in which access to commerce is conditional upon allegiance and servitude to a central authority, a structure that finds a secular parallel in contemporary U.S. Trump-era economic statecraft, particularly the use of tariffs, sanctions, and military leverage to compel compliance from other states. The Trump administration's America First philosophy did not invent U.S. economic coercion, but rather stripped away the institutional veils that had previously softened its exercise, revealing the underlying unipolar logic that had long characterized the post-Cold War order. The so-called rules-based system embodied by institutions like the World Trade Organization was never a neutral arena of liberal commerce, but rather a mechanism through which the United States, as the hegemon, codified its advantages into ostensibly universal norms, using dispute resolution mechanisms and multilateral agreements to open foreign markets while preserving its own strategic protections. Trump's sweeping tariffs, imposed on allies and rivals alike under the justification of national security, represented not a rupture with this logic, but an intensification and demystification of it, replacing the indirect coercion of institutional arbitration with the naked leverage of unilateral market access. Where the rules-based order operated through bureaucratic processes and pseudo-legalistic justifications that nonetheless served U.S. interests, Trump's tariff-based unilateralism simply discarded the procedural camouflage, making explicit what had always been implicit, that participation in the global economy depends on compliance with the preferences of the unipolar power. Beyond the realm of tariffs, the second Trump administration has pursued direct military intervention across multiple domains with far greater intensity than in his first term, and these operations have spanned a significant number of countries including Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, etc. These modern instruments of statecraft, sanctions, the rules-based order, tariff-based order, and now direct military and cyber intervention, show a proclivity toward the beast's core methodology, which is the use of economic connectivity as a mechanism to enforce compliance and punish dissent, with the added dimension of kinetic and digital force when economic pressure alone proves insufficient. The ongoing war with Iran has made clear that there can be no genuine freedom of navigation, as the United States claims to uphold, without the parallel principle of freedom of commerce, since navigation loses its meaning if a nation cannot freely buy and sell the goods it transports. Since the outset of his second term, Trump revived and intensified a maximum pressure campaign of broad economic sanctions against Tehran, a policy that escalated into war and announced a planned blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Navy has conducted freedom of navigation operations in the Persian Gulf, yet Washington simultaneously denies Iran the freedom to export its oil, severing the very commerce that navigation is meant to serve. Thus, when the United States speaks of freedom of navigation, it means freedom for U.S. and allied vessels, while reserving the right to interdict, sanction, or blockade any vessel trading with an adversary, transforming navigation from a universal right into a privilege granted only to those who submit to U.S. dictates. The biblical archetype of the beast and its mark, drawn from the book of Revelation as a coded critique of Roman totalitarianism, presents a dystopian climax where the complete fusion of political and economic authority into a single mechanism of control serves as the ultimate litmus test of allegiance, gatekeeping the very basics of survival to enforce ideological conformity. Like a tariff, which alters the terms of participation, the mark dictates the possibility of participation in the market under certain conditions mandating servitude. Therefore, the policies of the second Trump administration, combining economic sanctions, tariff unilateralism, military intervention, and cyber operations, are a contemporary, secular example of how powerfully commerce can be leveraged to bend nations to a will, reminding us that whether under the rules-based order or the tariff-based order, the logic of the beast is never far beneath the surface. President Trump has been explicit about forcing strategic submission through a diplomacy of ultimatums, as these threats are also consistent with his attempt to break BRICS and prevent it from creating a new global economic network. This danger is nowhere more acute than in Latin America, a region that is now at grave risk of becoming a neo-colonial, U.S.-dominated unipolar sphere of influence with no genuine decision-making power of its own, because the Washington Consensus has historically treated the whole hemisphere as a backyard rather than a partnership. And the Trump administration's second-term interventions show a pattern of treating Latin American sovereignty as non-existent. The Trumpian version of the Monroe Doctrine lives on in this practice of unilaterally determining the legitimate governments and economic destinies of the region and their abilities to do capitalist commerce, as seen in the U.S. blockade and designation of Venezuela as a foreign terrorist organization, and in the broader pattern of pressuring Brazil, Argentina, and other nations over trade policies. For Latin America, the beast's mark takes the form of dollar-denominated trade dependencies, the threat of secondary sanctions against any nation that dares to trade with Venezuela or Iran, and the ever-present threat of military intervention or naval blockade against any government that pursues an independent path, whether that be resource nationalization, trade with China, or regional integration outside U.S.-led frameworks. If Latin America cannot buy or sell freely without the approval of Washington, if their currencies, central banks, trade routes, and even their access to global shipping lanes are subject to U.S. veto, then they already wear a digital mark of economic servitude.